An antagonist doesn't have to be a person. Don't get me wrong, having an antagonist as a person is probably often the way to go. Intelligent opposition for the characters can be some of the most rewarding. But there are different forms of conflict. Classically, person versus person, person versus self, and person versus environment are the three most common. Since as the GM you have no agency over the player characters, then person versus self is generally out the window, which just leaves the other two. But how often do you actually run person versus environment? In fact, I'd like to rename person versus environment to person versus situation, or scene. I do it all the time, and my players have had wicked fun with it, and I generally handle it in one of two ways. The first way is an action sequence. I do believe some editions of D&D it was still known as a skill challenge, but since I use it in various RPGs and it doesn't always just involve skills, then action sequence or action challenge just sound better. This setup is that you have a number of successes players may need to achieve as a group. For every failure, either something bad happens or they're one step closer to a threshold you set as a total failure amount. Go around the table. Initiative order is not needed for this. Ask each player what they would be doing to contribute to the situation. Don't think in terms of combat. Tell them not even to look at their character sheets even. Narratively describe what they want to do to help the situation or to help someone else helping in the situation. Once you have all of the actions together, then figure out what the roles would be. An ability check, a skill check, a power or spell with a roll, maybe just adding a bonus to another player's roll. It doesn't matter what order you do them in, just find the final tallies and then make some rolls. Here's an example. I had a group of players transporting crates of something on a cargo plane. That plane got attacked by another plane. I decided to run this as an action challenge because it would get the entire group involved instead of just the pilot. Plus, I didn't want to worry about initiative or statistics for the plane. At the end of the challenge, I was going to let them escape with their lives in the plane no matter what. That wasn't the real challenge. However, they still needed a certain amount of successes to escape with whatever was still in the cargo hold, and in this situation, each failure resulted in the loss of one of the crates out of the back of the plane, and there were 6 crates. Thus, I made an action-packed scenario that wasn't necessarily life or death, but did have a losing condition, as they slowly lost more and more cargo. If the players had 6 failures, they lost the entire cargo and went on to their destination empty. They still got there, but they had nothing to show for it. That's one way to deal with an entire scene, and you could use that for anything, escaping a horde of zombies, fleeing the collapsing starbase, etc. The other way I sometimes run things is to treat the scene as its own NPC. I'll stat it out just like I would an opponent or monster, then I'll run it much like I would combat. However, I would allow ways to hurt it beyond a normal combat. Obviously, this works better in certain systems than others. Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder don't always mesh with this quite as well since 99% of their rules are just about hurting bad guys with combat and attacks. Systems like Fate or Cypher work very well here. I'll give an example I used in Numenera using the Cypher system. The players were riding on their makeshift gravity sled vehicle thing that they had cobbled together and were racing through the Cloud Crystal Skyfields, a northern locale full of floating crystals, some the size of your hand and some truly monumentally large, like I'm talking an entire city block or larger. The scene I ran was that the players were speeding under 2 of the larger floating crystals when those 2 crystals collided. Shards the size of needles to the size of skyscrapers plummeted to the ground below. I treated the scene itself as a creature. I gave it a difficulty level, health, abilities, attacks, etc. It even got its own turn in the initiative order. Players could use any task to try and harm it. Some of the players used traditional combat abilities to blast crystals out of the way or knock them aside, dealing damage to the scene's quote-unquote health. But many of the players wanted to use other skills, like piloting for the gravity barge or keeping a lookout for better paths to follow. In those cases, I treated their skills kind of like attacks versus the scenario. If they had an inability, it'd only do 1 point of damage and couldn't benefit from bonus damage at high rolls. Practiced was like a light weapon, trained skills were as medium weapons, and specialized in a task meant it was like a heavy weapon. Much like the action challenge, this meant players felt free to be truly creative in how they dealt with the situation. They could use combat abilities, but they could also just use any other ability or skill, etc. or even a generic action and just make a straight task roll from one of their pools. So there we have it. Don't be afraid to make an antagonist the environment. Maybe don't make the primary antagonist the environment, but there's nothing stopping you from doing that either. What if the entire premise is the players being stuck in a collapsing station on the moon? The primary antagonist isn't a monster or a villain. It's the harsh, cold void of space and the collapsing station they're trying to get out of. So be creative. Using NPCs and monsters is fine, but remember, there are other things you can use as well. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good one, eh?